Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to the second week of our knowledge series. The schedule for the second week has already been put up in the community section of our YouTube channel. So please go there, take a look at all the upcoming sessions in our knowledge series. If you're liking the initiative, do let us know by liking the video, share the videos with your fellow aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Before we begin, we have another big announcement. Starting today, we shall be launching Target Mains 2022, which will be exclusive on the Byjus Exam Prep app. This Target Mains course is designed to help those aspirants who are preparing for this year's mains. We are going to cover all the important topics from both static and current affairs. We'll also focus more on answer writing, where the faculties will discuss model answers by taking practice questions. So if you want to benefit from this course, the Target Mains 2022, don't forget to download the Byjus Exam Prep app, and the link for the same has been given in the description and as well as in the comments below. So with this, let's start today's discussion under the knowledge series. Today, we are focusing on a very important topic under international relations. We're going to talk about a grouping known as the Quad or the Quadrilateral. So let's understand every important detail about the Quad, which can help you in your prelims and as well as in your mains. I'm sure many of you would have heard about this grouping called the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It is essentially an informal diplomatic and strategic platform between four like-minded democracies. This grouping focuses on one of the most important regions of the world, which is the Indo-Pacific region. See, in today's geopolitics, the Indo-Pacific region has emerged as the focal point. In fact, in the last 20 to 30 years, the Indo-Pacific has become the focal point for the global economy and as well as for global geopolitics. During the Cold War, however, that's between 1950 and 1991, the Atlantic Ocean was the focal point of the global economy and global geopolitics. Because it was in and around the Atlantic that all the major developments were taking place. All the big powers, the big economies, the big military powers were all located in and around the Atlantic during the Cold War era. So naturally, the Atlantic was the focal point of global economy and global geopolitics. But post-Cold War, after the Cold War ended, the European powers, they started declining. Their economies, their military strength, their diplomatic strength started declining. Parallelly, from 1990s and early 2000, the Asian powers rose up. They registered tremendous economic growth and they also became very significant geopolitical players. So as a result, the fulcrum of geopolitics and the focal point of the global economy has shifted from the west to the east, that is from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. So in this Indo-Pacific region, naturally a competition began between the major powers, especially between China and the United States. Many experts point out that this is a new Cold War that has begun between the current major powers of the world, that is China and US. As a part of this geopolitical game that goes on in the Indo-Pacific, a grouping has been formed that focuses specifically on this region called the Quad or the Quadrilateral. See, Quadrilateral is referred to as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It is an informal diplomatic grouping. It's a strategic grouping of four like-minded democracies, that is India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. These four like-minded democracies that you can see in the map over here are focused on enforcing a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. This is their primary objective. It is not a formal organization like the United Nations or NATO, doesn't have a treaty of its own, but it functions in an informal manner, and these four countries use the Quad as a platform to coordinate and to collaborate together in all major policy decisions related to the Indo-Pacific. So now that you know what is the Quad, it's important for you to develop an in-depth understanding of this grouping. You need to examine its origins. You need to examine its current status. What are the major initiatives that have been taken up by the Quad? See, the Quad grouping traces back its origin all the way back to 2004. In 2004, the Indian Ocean region was devastated by a massive tsunami. I'm sure many of you would have read about it, heard about it. This tsunami that hit the Indian Ocean region, it devastated many countries including India, Indonesia, Thailand and the others. So following this disaster, a few major military powers of the region, they started collaborating to provide disaster management assistance or HADR assistance, that is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to the affected countries. So 4 countries came together to provide this HADR assistance that included India, Japan, US and Australia. Because all these are major powers in the Indo-Pacific. India definitely dominates the Indian Ocean. Australia is a major power in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. Japan is definitely a major power in the Pacific, and the US already had a significant military presence both in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So as they started helping out the countries during the tsunami, they started collaborating their efforts. Their respective navies, which were leading these HADR operations, they started working together. These 4 governments collaborated to provide disaster management assistance, especially to help in relief and rescue operations during this tsunami. This was the first time that these 4 countries had come together, that too in the military dimension, in the military domain. So this became a platform based on which the then Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he proposed the idea of bringing these 4 like-minded democracies together into a strategic military alliance. Because by this time, China had risen to power. China had emerged as a major power of the Indo-Pacific, and it was clearly emerging as a global power as well. So this rise of China was aggressive. China was picking disputes with most of its neighboring countries, including Japan, India, and many Southeast Asian countries. So as tensions were increasing between China and Japan, Japan came up with the idea that the 4 like-minded democracies which have interests in the Indo-Pacific, that is India, US, Australia and Japan, they need to collaborate, they need to come together to jointly counter Chinese aggression. So this idea was initially proposed by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2006. Based on this proposal, these 4 countries, they held their first informal meeting in 2007, and in the same year they would hold a major multilateral maritime exercise, a military exercise called the Malabar. You might have heard about the Malabar naval exercise. Essentially, the Malabar naval exercise was a bilateral naval exercise just between India and US. But in 2007, India elevated the Malabar exercise to a multilateral naval exercise. Along with US, India also invited Japan, Australia and Singapore, which are major stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific. So in 2007, the Malabar exercise became a multilateral naval exercise involving like-minded democracies which were looking to stabilize the Indo-Pacific region. This was the first time that these countries were coming together, at least in an informal way. But China was very unhappy with this military exercise. China expressed its displeasure, and especially it stepped up its tensions against India and Australia, and it pushed these countries to move away from any such military alliances. So under this pressure, Australia backed out of the Malabar exercise from the next year. Australia declined to participate in the Malabar exercise as China was getting more and more aggressive. So as China was getting more aggressive, Australia would back out from this exercise, and India would also stop conducting this multilateral naval exercise. India returned it back into the bilateral format involving just the United States. So this marked the end of the so-called Quad grouping, which was the first version, the first edition of the Quad. After this, not much steps were taken to step up or to establish this grouping or this platform as a more solid platform for the Indo-Pacific. Because of Chinese pressure, because of the fear of China's retaliation, Australia backed out from this military alliance, and eventually India also took a step back, because India is the only country amongst the Quad members which shares an active border, a disputed border with China, that to a land boundary with China. So following this for 10 years, there was no Quad in place. The idea of Quad had been kept aside, especially by India and Australia. But US in particular started showing more and more interest especially from 2009, after it launched its pivot to Asia policy. In 2009, under then President Obama, the United States launched this ambitious policy shift where it started focusing more on the Asia region, the Indo-Pacific region. So under the pivot to Asia policy, the US started realigning its diplomatic and strategic assets and investments towards the Indo-Pacific. Because now the US realized that the main threat for the US came from China. The US was very eager to counter China's aggressive rise in the Indo-Pacific. So the US started pushing Japan, Australia and India to revive the quadrilateral. But India and Australia were hesitant for at least 10 years between 2007 and 2017. During this period, India's strategic relations with US started growing. Our strategic ties with Australia and Japan also started improving. And around the same time, China got more and more aggressive, especially against Japan, against India, and as well as against Australia. China picked maritime disputes with Japan in the East China Sea over a group of islands known as the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands. In fact, in this year's prelims, UPSC had asked a question on the Senkaku Islands. Parallelly, it started opening up new border disputes with India by carrying out deliberate incursions throughout 2010, 2013, 2015 and 17. Throughout this period, China carried out multiple incursions along the India-China border. Similarly, it stepped up economic and geopolitical pressure against Australia as well. So as China was getting more and more aggressive, these four like-minded democracies, they finally decided to come back together again and revive the Quad. So this is where we saw the opening of the second version, the second edition of the Quad, which had been previously cast aside, right? Between 2006 and 2007, we had seen the formation of the first version of the Quad. It was a very informal setup where one Malabar exercise was carried out, one multilateral naval exercise was carried out. Along with that, an informal meeting had been taken place. But apart from that, the Quad hadn't moved much, mainly because of China's resistance. But since China was getting more and more aggressive, and since it was picking more and more disputes with these countries finally decided in 2017 to come together and officially form the Quad as a diplomatic strategic grouping that would focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Again, it was Japan which proposed the idea of reviving the Quad. Following this, India, US, Australia, they all expressed their eagerness and they held their first working level meeting in Philippines at Manila, which is a close ally of Japan and US. So this marked the revival of the Quad. This was in 2017. Following this, few more informal meetings took place between the foreign ministers and defense ministers of these countries. Very soon, these countries even set up the 2+2 ministerial dialogues between themselves. Under the 2+2 ministerial format, the foreign ministers and defense ministers of these countries could interact with each other. For example, in 2018, India and US set up the 2+2 ministerial dialogue. Then India would set up similar 2+2 dialogues with Australia and Japan as well. So as these four like-minded democracies, as they started collaborating more in the strategic geopolitical domain, and as they started focusing on the military dimensions of the Indo-Pacific, the Quad was taking shape as an informal grouping of these countries. Very soon, India revived the multilateral Malabar exercise. In fact, in 2015 itself, Japan was invited back by India to participate in the Malabar naval exercise. As China kept increasing tensions with India and Japan, India brought Japan back into the Malabar naval exercise. So now Malabar had already become a trilateral naval exercise between India, US and Japan. And in 2020, Australia was also brought back into Malabar exercise, and now essentially these four Quad countries are taking part regularly in the annual Malabar naval exercise. Especially after China increased its tensions with India in the Ladakh sector since 2020, India decided to revive this informal military alliance, and India brought Australia back into the Malabar naval exercises. So this is how the Quad has been revived, and in the last 2 years, there have been very, very big developments with regard to Quad. It is not just a sidelined grouping anymore. It has been fully revived by these countries, and they have even started holding summit level meetings, meaning the head of states, head of governments of these countries, that is their prime ministers and presidents, they have met multiple times in the last 2 years. There have been 2 virtual summits of the Quad that has been held, where the prime ministers and presidents of these 4 countries have participated. The first such virtual summit was held in 2021, March. This laid the foundation for the Quad, and it marked the full revival of the Quad grouping. Then last year in September 2021, the first ever Quad meeting took place in person. In-person meeting was held last year, where the 4 leaders of these countries, including Prime Minister Modi, US President Joe Biden, they all came together and held the first in-person meeting last year. Following this, they've held one more virtual summit this year in March 2022, and just a couple of weeks back in May 2022, the second in-person meeting also has taken place. So this is what makes the Quad so interesting and so very important for our exams as well. Because even though Quad is an informal grouping, even though it doesn't have a formal setup or a treaty, even though it doesn't have a secretariat or a headquarters, it still plays a key role in the Indo-Pacific and in stabilizing the Indo-Pacific region. So if you ask me what is Quad at the end, is it a military alliance? Is it a strategic grouping? Essentially, the Quad is an informal grouping. It is a loosely structured military alliance cum economic trade bloc that these 4 countries are shaping in the Indo-Pacific. The idea is not just to form a military alliance like the NATO. The idea is to ensure that the Quad becomes an effective counterweight, a counterbalance to China's rapid and aggressive rise in the Indo-Pacific. So that is why the primary objective of the Quad, the primary objective of this grouping is to enforce a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Because in the Indo-Pacific, China has been breaking international rules. In the last few years, in the last 15-20 years, China has picked many maritime disputes with countries in the Indo-Pacific, especially with the Southeast Asian countries. It has picked maritime disputes with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Japan. You might have heard about the various maritime disputes in the South China Sea. At islands such as the Paracel Group of Islands, the Spratly Islands, the Natuna Islands, the Scarborough Shoal of Philippines. Then even in the East China Sea, where you have the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands that is claimed by Japan. So across this stretch of the Indo-Pacific, across South China Sea and East China Sea, China has picked multiple maritime disputes with Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries. China has broken international rules and laws as codified under UN clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The UN clause, it defines maritime zones, how maritime territorial zones are identified, and it provides for an international basis, an international legal basis for dividing maritime zones between countries. But China has blatantly violated the UN clause provisions. It has unilaterally claimed almost the entire of South China Sea to itself. And to enhance its claims, it has used aggression, even military aggression. It has built artificial islands in South China Sea and East China Sea. It has been using its Coast Guard, its Navy and Air Force to threaten freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight for ships and aircraft in the Indo-Pacific. These rights are basic rights or fundamental rights as recognized under UN clause. In international waters or even in international airspace, navigating a ship or flying an aircraft is a basic right, a fundamental right recognized under the UN clause. But the Chinese armed forces, the PLA Navy, the PLA Air Force, they have been disrupting freedom of navigation and overflight, and this is threatening the very stability of the Indo-Pacific. See, Indo-Pacific is very crucial because nearly 60% of the global trade passes through the Indo-Pacific. Most countries depend on it, including India. Most of our imports and exports, they are carried through the Indo-Pacific. But China's military aggression, its active usage of its military to threaten freedom of navigation and overflight in the Indo-Pacific, threatens global shipping and the global economy itself. So China has essentially broken international laws and international rules, and it has disrupted the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific. So the Quad countries are primarily focused on this. They want to enforce the international rules. They want to enforce the international laws and ensure that every country, including China, abide by these international rules. Even though this is not the formally stated objective, even though they don't officially state out that Quad is against China or to counter China, the inherent objective of the Quad is to enforce the rules-based order, enforce UN clause and international rules so that all countries are bound by it, and this should help in containing China's aggression in the region. So the primary objective is to maintain the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific and to counter China's aggression and maritime claims, which are threatening stability in the region with the possibility of triggering a potential war or a conflict between these countries. So that is why the Quad grouping is so important. Apart from this, the Quad countries came out with a statement. When they held the first Quad summit in 2021, the first in-person summit, when it was held last September, the four countries, they held a dialogue, a strategic dialogue was held between the prime ministers and presidents, and they brought out the spirit of the Quad. If you look at this document, you will get to know what are the priorities of the Quad. See, today the Quad has been diversified. It is not just a strategic grouping or an informal military alliance. It has gone beyond that, especially because India has pushed the Quad in that direction. See, the other members of the Quad like US and Japan, they wanted to turn Quad into a formal military setup, something like the NATO. They wanted to turn the Quad something into the version of the Asian NATO. But India and even Australia to an extent have strongly resisted these attempts, especially India, because India follows a principle of strategic autonomy. India's foreign policy is based on the principle of strategic autonomy. We follow an independent foreign policy and we have never entered into any military clubs or military alliances. To maintain this stand, which is the bedrock of India's foreign policy, and to not unnecessarily trigger China by forming a military grouping, India has pushed the Quad to diversify this grouping. This was reflected in the spirit of Quad statement, because it identified the priority areas of Quad, and it is not just limited to military alliance and military exercises. It goes beyond that. Of course, its primary focus is on maritime security, but it also set up a working group to focus on vaccine development and vaccine distribution to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. It focused on pooling the resources of these four members so that they can help the Indo-Pacific countries and the other countries of the world to combat the pandemic through better vaccine development and vaccine distribution. They even set up a working group on critical and emerging technologies to focus on cybersecurity, to focus on emerging critical technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. So they are focusing on these other domains as well. They also set up a working group to focus on climate change, because Indo-Pacific region is very vulnerable to the risk of climate change. It's very vulnerable to disasters like cyclones, extreme weather events, etc. So they have set up a working group on climate change to decarbonize the region and to focus on clean and renewable energy. They are also focusing on promoting space cooperation, promoting the civilian application of space technology, and they're also focusing on making the global supply chains resilient. Because in the Indo-Pacific, the supply chains were largely dominated by China, and when the pandemic hit the world, the global supply chains were disrupted. Especially when China went into a lockdown, when the pandemic started, the supply chains of the Indo-Pacific, which were dependent on China, they took a complete hit. This affected manufacturing, it affected economic activities around the region and around the world. So these countries have committed to make the supply chains more resilient and diversify it and move it away from China's dominance. So in many ways, the Quad is not just a military alliance anymore. Of course, when it started, it did have a military angle. But today it is much more than that. It has branched out into many other areas of economic cooperation. It also focuses on technical and technological cooperation. They are prioritizing digital economy as well. So many new areas of cooperation have been opened up under the quadrilateral grouping. Just 2 weeks back, in May 2022, the second in-person Quad summit was held, in which two major initiatives have been announced. The Quad countries have announced the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. This will be a surveillance initiative which will monitor the shipping traffic of the Indo-Pacific. See, the Quad countries like India, Japan, Australia and US, they already have capabilities to monitor the movement of ships in the Indo-Pacific. For example, under India's Sagar Doctrine, which focuses on the Indian Ocean region, India has set up the coastal surveillance radar, not just along India's coastline, but we have also set up and extended this project to our friendly island countries like Seychelles, Mauritius, etc. So India maintains a network of coastal radars across the Indian Ocean, which is helping us monitor the shipping traffic in real time of the Indian Ocean. All this data, this radar data, is fed into the Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region, IFC-IOR. This is the headquarters of the Coastal Surveillance Radar Project of India. It's handled by the Indian Navy, and this facility, this entire project, gives the Indian Navy a complete picture of the shipping traffic of the Indian Ocean. Similarly, Japan, Australia and US have their own initiatives across the Indo-Pacific. So they are going to pool their information about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, about the movement of ships in the region, and they are going to set up a surveillance network to keep a check on illegal fishing and as well as to check dark shipping. That is illegal shipping that takes place in the Indo-Pacific, which is largely backed by China. China is known to threaten the fishing rights of many coastal countries in the Indo-Pacific because China has unilateral claims over the exclusive economic zone of many countries. China has even promoted active disruption of the shipping rights of other countries. It has encouraged illegal fishing of Chinese boats. So to keep a check on dark shipping and illegal fishing, the Quad countries are setting up a maritime domain awareness initiative for the Indo-Pacific region. This was recently announced at the second in-person Quad summit. And along with that, they've announced an economic initiative, a trade initiative called the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. This is a very, very big initiative of these countries, along with many other countries of the Southeast Asia, East Asia region. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, will essentially be a trade arrangement that's going to bring around 13 countries of the region together. Along with the 4 Quad members, that's along with India, Australia, Japan and US, many ASEAN members of ASEAN group like Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia and Brunei. These countries, which are also having similar interests against China, are coming together to form an economic arrangement along with New Zealand and South Korea. In fact, some of these countries, they're already part of another economic arrangement with China, which is led by China, called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. India, however, was also part of RCEP negotiations earlier, but recently in 2019, India has quit RCEP. For several reasons, India felt threatened by RCEP free trade agreement and we quit the negotiations. This free trade arrangement is mainly dominated and led by China. So to counter RCEP and China's economic dominance in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad countries are leading a parallel economic trade arrangement called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This was launched during the recent Quad summit that took place in May 2022. India has also joined this initiative and the negotiations are going to take place to work out a trade arrangement between these 13 countries of the Indo-Pacific. They'll focus on trade facilitation. They'll focus on creating a digital economy and digital infrastructure for the region. They'll focus on building resiliency in the supply chains. They'll also focus on clean energy initiatives to decarbonize Indo-Pacific and to promote action in the field of climate change and global warming. They're also going to work together to create connectivity infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific and to harmonize their laws regarding labor standards, environmental standards, IP laws, etc. Essentially, it would be a trade arrangement, a trade facilitation arrangement that would boost trade volume amongst these 13 like-minded countries of the Indo-Pacific. So this framework, this economic framework, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, has been launched during the Quad summit, and this goes on to show that the Quad has really diversified over the years. I'm stressing on this point because in 2020, UPSC had actually asked a mains question on these lines. UPSC had asked that the Quad is no longer just a military alliance. It is more and more becoming a trade bloc. Discuss. The question that was asked by UPSC was on these lines. So there is a lot of scope under this topic, both for prelims and mains, for questions to come from the Quad grouping. So these are the important details and analysis that you should be aware of about the quadrilateral. And with this, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. So now let us spend a few minutes in answering all your doubts and questions. And after that, we are going to sign off from today's session. The first question, what's the difference between Quad and IPEF? See, Quad is an informal security dialogue. It's a diplomatic strategic dialogue that brings India, Japan, US and Australia together. IPEF is an economic trade arrangement involving the Quad countries. It's led by the Quad countries, but it also includes many other countries of the Indo-Pacific. Right? You can see the countries which have signed up for Indo-Pacific economic framework over here. Right? It's much larger than the Quad. It's an economic arrangement, whereas Quad is a military and a strategic arrangement between the four like-minded democracies. Next question, what is 2+2 dialogue? See, 2+2 dialogue is a diplomatic format in which the defense minister and foreign minister of both the countries interact simultaneously. So for example, India-US have a 2+2 dialogue. So when the 2+2 dialogue takes place, it means India's defense and foreign ministers, they simultaneously meet the US Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. So it gives an opportunity for the countries to discuss common foreign policy and security issues. It's only countries which are very close strategically, only those countries have a 2+2 dialogue. Next question, sir, does formation of AUKUS undermine the Quad? See, AUKUS refers to a trilateral initiative between Australia, UK and US. It was recently launched, it was launched last year by US, UK and Australia. It is more of a military initiative. Under AUKUS, US and UK have promised to provide nuclear submarine technology to Australia to strengthen their maritime security capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. If you compare AUKUS and Quad, yes, there are slight differences. AUKUS is clearly a military initiative between these countries because it involves the transfer of military technology, the two critical military technology. But the Quad is not too heavily focused on military initiatives alone. Yes, there is the Malabar naval exercise between these countries, but the Quad is much larger than that. It is much more diversified. It focuses on climate change, vaccine development. It is focusing on trade arrangements like Indo-Pacific economic framework. It is focusing on creating resilient supply chains. It's focusing on critical technologies and emerging technologies. So Quad is a much more diversified group as compared to AUKUS. AUKUS is more of a military initiative. It's too early to say whether AUKUS would undermine the Quad. Both have their own unique space that they're operating in the Indo-Pacific region. Next question. Sir, can any other country be members of Quad like NATO in the future? Definitely yes, it's possible. It's possible for other countries to join the Quad. There have been discussions on these lines as well. In fact, there has been a Quad Plus meeting which has also taken place. Countries like South Korea, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, they've all shown interest to become part of the Quad. But as of now, there has been no expansion, but certain talks have been held to possibly expand the membership of the Quad in the future. Next question, whether Quad will be limited to these countries? It's the same question, I already answered it. Last question, sir, how is Quad going to impact China's interests? See, China has referred to the Quad as the Asian NATO. China clearly sees the Quad as a military threat. It has criticized India, US, Japan and Australia for forming this alliance which is indirectly or directly designed to counter China's interests in the Indo-Pacific. So in the eyes of China, the quadrilateral is a major threat, a diplomatic threat, a strategic threat and a military threat. So China has clearly taken a stand against the Quad. It has even called it the Asian NATO because China knows very well that the initiatives of Quad will counter China's dominance in the region. The enforcement of UN clause, the enforcement of international rules, the creation of parallel economic arrangements, the creation of parallel supply chains will all threaten China's economic, military and strategic interests. So this brings our discussion to an end. With this, I would like to close our session for today. If you like the initiative, do let us know by liking the video, share your comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.